This is Creepy, a podcast dedicated to sharing the most famous, chilling, and disturbing creepypastas and urban legends in the world. Whether these stories truly happened or are simply fabrications is for you to decide. These stories may contain graphic depictions of violence and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Creepy presents My Father Slowly Went Mad. Written by Bent Thoughts. The rain pattered loudly against the tin roof of the converted barn. Though still rustic, this barn house is now a small rental off the Gulf Coast of Florida. And naturally, with this being the Gulf Coast of Florida, it had been raining since last night. I'd planned on coming here to do some fishing. I wasn't a huge fan of fishing, but my father had been. I knew in his last few months of his life he'd been visiting this place pretty regularly. And this was how I was going to grieve him. A few, or maybe several, cold beers, and participating in his favorite pastime at one of his favorite places. However, it seemed that Florida might get in the way of that. Well, in the way of the fishing, anyway. I was already nursing my second beer of the evening, about to go sit outside and stare at the tide edging closer and then crawling back out to sea. Tomorrow, I promised myself. Tomorrow, I would take my father's fishing kayak out onto the water and honor him by trying to catch something, rain or shine. It hadn't stopped raining yet, so I didn't want my plans to be dependent on that anymore. As I sat outside, still working on my second beer, a third already waiting on the small table in front of me, a fog rolled out over the water. In the dying light, the purple haze of the sky and smoky blue of the fog combined to make a darkening shadow over the ocean. There was nothing as far as the eye could see towards the horizon but the shadows playing across the placid water and the deepening darkness of the sky. When I woke up the next morning, the sky was still a dark gray. No rain yet, but the thick billowing clouds didn't look promising. I downed a cup of black coffee, then committed myself to preparing for my day. Despite it being 9 a.m., I went ahead and packed a small soft cooler with a few beers. On a whim, I also poured a healthy amount of my father's favorite bourbon I'd brought on the trip into a travel mug, and put that in the cooler as well. I figured if I was going to do this, I wanted to do it right. And maybe also a bit buzzed. I retrieved my father's fishing rod, kayak, and paddle from where I'd propped them against the wall near the front door. The barn's high ceilings had made it possible to store the boat upright indoors, away from the rain and wind. I dragged and lugged everything down to the water's edge, which wasn't too far a walk from the barn. The morning air was cool, but still humid. I pushed off into the calm waters and paddled out for a while. There was mist shrouding the surface of the water, and dark clouds hung ominously overhead. I decided I didn't want to be out here long. My entire purpose for being here was to experience something my father enjoyed so that I wasn't sure exactly. So that I could have some resolution, so that I'd have closure. I hadn't spoken to my father in almost a year when he died of a heart attack. We hadn't had an outright falling out, but I'd begun to avoid him. He'd become increasingly paranoid and off. His health declined. He lost too much weight, and he muttered to himself. He would call me in the middle of the night rambling about shadows and evil and telling me he was being watched. If I'm being honest, it was unsettling. I chalked it up to my father's penchant for drinking a little too much, which had seemed to increase closer to his death. I told myself I need to distance myself from him and his problems. Even though I'd stopped talking with my father, my brother still kept in touch with him. and I knew from the few times I was willing to talk about my father, he'd continued to spiral. He was coming out to this beach more often, and coming back more and more frazzled and manic. And then, one day, soon after visiting this very place, my father had a heart attack and died. For months, the guilt ate away at me, and I'd wake up in the middle of the night expecting to get a call from my father about the shadows he feared. I cracked open a beer and drank deeply. So needless to say, I didn't attend the funeral. My brother had to do the planning and arrangements since I'd refused, and our mother hadn't been in our lives since our parents had divorced when we were young children. I just couldn't be there. I couldn't see his body that had wasted away, or think about his mind that had wasted away just as much, if not more. This trip, though, this was supposed to be where I said goodbye. I'm not traditionally poetic, but I thought I'd try to do something that felt like saying goodbye in a language Dad could understand, in a way that helped me remember what I loved about him. I quickly finished my beer and opened another one. Not only was I not traditionally poetic, but I also did traditionally suppress my feelings. I cast the fishing line and secured the rod to one of the fishing rod holders built into the kayak. I lazily continued drinking and waiting for a fish to bite. A loud crack of thunder jolted me awake. Startled, I spilled the beer I was loosely holding down the front of my shirt. Shit, I cursed. I must have nodded off, but I wasn't sure for how long. Large drops of rain began pelting my body, and I saw lightning weave across the clouds overhead. More thunder seemed to shake the sky. Shit, I repeated. I quickly reeled in the fishing line and grabbed my paddle. I looked around, but I didn't see the shore. Panic threatened to seize my mind, so I gulped down several deep breaths of the salty ocean air. How had I floated so far out? It looked like I dozed off for a decent bit of time. I took more deep breaths as I tried to ignore my growing fear of not knowing how to get back to land. All of a sudden, I saw a large light dance across the water. Curious, I followed it towards the horizon and looked up. A lighthouse rose up against the dark sky, its light swiveling out amongst the waves that were beginning to pick up in response to the swelling storm. Given that I couldn't see the shore and I didn't want to capsize in the ever-escalating water, I desperately paddled toward the patch of land the lighthouse sat atop. Veins of lightning still laced the clouds around me, and the thunder was ear-splitting. I knew that storms could crop up fast here in the Gulf, but I was still surprised at the intensity and swiftness of this one. By the time I reached the sandy shore of the lighthouse, my arms were burning from the effort of paddling through the waves. The storm was roiling across the ocean, and I knew I needed to wait until morning to attempt to get back to the barn house. Waterlogged from the downpour that was only steadily picking up, I slowly dragged the boat far enough onto land that I hoped it would still be there in the morning. I walked up to the door of the lighthouse and knocked. I wasn't really sure how this worked. Were there still lighthouse keepers? When no one answered, I tried the rusting metal handle on the dry rotting door. It haltingly turned, and I pushed the door open. A shiver ran up my spine as the hinges creaked in an unsettling way. The darkness inside was suffocating. I pulled my phone from my pocket. I had no signal here, but the flashlight worked fine. I shined the bright white light around the lighthouse. Nothing too special. There was a very small stove to the far left with a metal tea kettle sitting on top. A rickety-looking table with 2 chairs sat to the left of me as well. To the right, a spiraling staircase led upwards. Resigning myself to an overnight stay, I decided to explore. I ascended the staircase, curious about what else would be here. The stairs led to another, even smaller floor that had only a narrow bed. The stairs continued upwards from there to the very top, where the roving light bulb was perched. I went back down the stairs and sat in one of the wooden chairs on the first floor. Sheets of rain battered the old building, and thunder echoed across the ocean outside. Since I'd already resolved to be here for the night, I figured I'd go ahead and get as comfortable as possible. I slung my soft cooler off my shoulder and onto the table, taking out the travel mug filled with bourbon. I took a long swig and let the burning liquid fill me with a more comfortable warmth than that of the humid climate of Florida. I took another drink and closed my eyes. And then I was crying. I felt the hot tears slip down my face, escalating in intensity just like the storm outside. I hadn't let myself cry yet, but the exhaustion and stress of paddling, getting lost in a storm coupled with 100 proof for this bourbon took away any strength I had left to stuff my feelings. It felt good to release some tension. It had been a long day. Hell, a long last few months. I raised the cup in an imaginary cheers to my father and took another drink, rubbing the back of my hand along both my eyes and wiping away my tears. I felt a lightheaded numbness spread throughout my body. My shoulders relaxed a little, and I breathed in the smell of dust and old damp wood. And then I heard something. The storm raged on outside, but I heard something inside. There was a tapping noise coming from the upper levels of the lighthouse. At first I froze, trying to brace myself against the dizziness from both my drink and the rush of adrenaline I suddenly felt. I strained my ears to try and make out what the noise could be. And then I shook my head in embarrassment, telling myself it was probably a leak, or at the very worst, a trapped seagull. I settled back into the creaky wooden chair and took another swig of bourbon. I could see in this sort of setting how my father might have felt a little unnerved. He had come here so often, according to my brother. It couldn't have been good for his paranoia. I suppressed my unease and checked my cell phone to see if I had any signal. Still nothing. And then the tapping resumed, but more feverish. I felt my booze-warmed body go cold. There was definitely something alive making that noise. Deciding that I didn't want to develop any kind of debilitating paranoia, I squared my shoulders and stood up. With my phone flashlight in hand, I cautiously approached the stairs. I braced myself on the metal railing for a moment. My head was swimming a bit from the whiskey. The tapping sounded sort of like footsteps, like someone was climbing up and down the stairs on the other 2 levels. But something wasn't quite right. There were too many taps for this to be footsteps. It sounded like something on 4 legs. Confused, I used my cell phone light again and swayed up the stairs, frustrated with how quickly the alcohol had gone to my head. As I got to the 2nd level with the bed, the tapping noises stopped. I walked to the thin bed that was against the wall and frowned. The sheets were turned back, like someone had recently gotten out of the bed. I didn't remember this from earlier. Then again, I hadn't been paying close attention. I rolled my eyes at my own paranoia and sat on the bed. As soon as my body hit that bed, I felt exhaustion weigh me down. I was so tired. And the rain outside, with the intermittent thunder, felt like an invitation to sleep. I hesitated to lie down, but the tapping noises had ceased again. Was I making this up? Was it just the rain, or the wind, or a leak? I set an alarm on my phone for the morning. I decided getting at least some rest would be helpful for when I tried to set out the next morning. It had been a long day. According to my phone, it was 3 a.m. when I heard tapping again. This time it sounded closer, and in my half-asleep state, I shone my flashlight wildly around the room. For a moment, it looked like the light caught the glint of several reflective orbs in the corner of the room. And then whatever it was gone. I squinted into the dark and pointed my flashlight in the direction of what I'd seen. But there was only darkness. Something wasn't right about that darkness, though, and it took me a moment to realize what it was. My flashlight wasn't able to pierce the shadows in the corner of the room. My phone wasn't illuminating anything. The darkness swallowed the light. That uneasy feeling of not being alone pricked the hairs on my arms. Then I heard the tapping overhead, on the floor that housed the large light bulb. More awake now, I was feeling a little bolder. I didn't want to let this place drive me mad. And deep down, I also didn't want to be alone in the room with that corner of shadows. Attempting to steel my nerves, I began ascending the spiral staircase. As I rounded the last corner, my phone's flashlight caught something quickly disappearing into the shadows. Slowly, I followed whatever it was with my light, and then dropped my phone. A creature, the size of a child, was sitting in the corner of the room. Its legs and arms were just elongated stumps without hands or feet. Its head had scraggly strands of hair hanging down, and its face had only a large gaping hole with broken shards of teeth. Several large, unblinking, milky eyes stared at me. I slowly backed up, not bothering to pick up my phone. At my movement, the thing rose up onto all fours of its unnervingly long limbs, and with alarming speed scrambled towards me. So I ran. I ran so fast, and then I tripped going down the stairs and fell onto my face on the landing to the second level of the house. Quickly getting to my feet, I felt warm, sticky blood run from my nose. I'd heard the quick tapping of the creature's stumps running after me until I'd fallen. It was silent in the lighthouse again, save for the sounds of rain and now receding thunder outside. Feeling frozen with fear, I stood still, straining my ears for any noises from whatever that thing was. And then I heard something dragging outside. Startled, my body tensed. Then I listened more carefully. The sound was familiar, but I couldn't place it. The sound of something being dragged across sand. My eyes widened, and I ran to the top level of the lighthouse and looked out of the panoramic window. The thing was dragging my father's kayak into the water. While I was debating whether or not to scream at it or try and hide, it turned its head towards me at an unnatural angle as it pushed the kayak into the water. The light from the lighthouse gleamed off the jagged remnants of its teeth and reflected off its several bulging eyes. After a moment, it began sprinting again towards the lighthouse on all four appendages, moving with the same fluid swiftness of a spider. I turned and took the stairs two at a time, running towards the lighthouse door. I slammed the wooden door closed and it shuddered against the force. I latched it and stepped back, shaking in terror. And then I heard something ram into the door. I backed up further, my eyes not leaving the door. The thing was using its long, stumped arms to beat against the door, as if it had battering rams at the end of each arm. The door sagged from the assault, and then one of the thing's arms broke through. Through the splintered wood, I saw a familiar face, and I blanched. My father. A few more moments and the door burst apart, and there was my father's form, raised up on all fours, with rounded stumps at the end of the unsettlingly long limbs, in the doorway. Only not my father exactly. Whatever this creature was doing to mimic him could only get the general likeness of his face. But the eye sockets were empty, and the mouth was still a gaping hole full of sharp teeth. I backed into a corner, falling to the ground. I felt icy terror, and then sinking dread as I watched the distorted imitation of my father slowly twist its head sideways. "You weren't there," a strangled voice said. My father's voice. The creature's mouth didn't move, even as words hoarsely reverberated through the house. "You didn't say goodbye." The creature choked out my father's voice again. I began shaking, tears freely falling, out of terror and a shadow of guilt. I wasn't sure how this creature knew these things, and I didn't know how to respond. The skin on the creature's face began to sag. My father's likeness began to melt, the empty eye sockets widening. "Please, please help me. I'm being watched. I can't get away." My stomach turned. This was an exact conversation I had had with my father. My father's strained voice continued pouring out of the thing's gaping mouth. The shadows have eyes. They watch me at night. They ask me to do terrible things." A shiver shuddered through my body. I tried very hard to repress this memory. This voicemail I'd gotten just days before my father had died. I hadn't told anyone, not even my brother. "They say to hurt you and your brother, but I don't want to. I don't want to." My father's voice choked at these words, and I felt my throat tighten. "They say if I don't, they'll hurt me. And I don't want that either." Any resemblance the creature had to my father melted away with its skin. Its face returned to what it had looked like originally, with its too many unseeing bulbous eyes. It cracked its head to the other side, and my father's voice continued. But the voice became full of static and slowed down like a broken tape. "You'll understand, won't you? You and your brother will understand. We'll be okay. We'll be okay." I watched without hope of escape as the creature bent its arms and legs with a sickening, cracking noise and sprinted towards me. I woke up to my alarm going off at 7 a.m. Startled, I jumped out of bed and looked around the room with my heart racing. There was nothing. Nothing in the room, no storm gusting outside. There was no sign of the night before. Or what I thought had been the night before. Had it all been a dream? Feeling confused and uneasy, I walked down the stairs, eyes darting around the lighthouse, looking for anything out of place. The mug of whiskey from the night before sat empty on the kitchen table. I felt my face warm. There had been a large pour in this mug. Exhaustion and dehydration could have caused some vivid nightmares. I let out a breath. That had just been a nightmare. A terrible, real feeling nightmare. When I got back to the Barnhouse rental, I would try and maybe process that nightmare a little more. And I felt a heaviness in my stomach. When I got back. If I got back. I ran to the door and flung it open, looking for my kayak. It was right where I'd left it, though more sandy and with some water I'd need to let out. I dared to let myself feel some relief. I packed up the kayak, bailed the water, and decided to try and find the shore. I knew it was a bit foolhardy, but there was no way I'd stay here another night. I could see if I got cell service, and I figured I could try and use my phone's compass. Not half an hour had passed when the shore and the rental house came into view. I felt bewildered. It felt like as soon as the lighthouse had passed out of view, the shore had become visible. I almost started crying at the sight of it. When I finally pulled the kayak onto the sandy beach, I dropped to my knees and began shaking. It took at least 5 minutes before I could regulate my breathing and stand up. I'd never felt so grateful and relieved in my life. I walked my slow and tired body to the house, and I immediately took a shower, I let the hot water calm and relax me. But I couldn't get my father's voice out of my head. Couldn't stop replaying the words from the voicemail he'd left me that had gurgled from that creature's mouth. After my shower, I put on clean, dry clothes. I poured myself a glass of bourbon, but didn't drink it. The thought of something bringing on another nightmare was enough for me to opt for a glass of water. Even though I wanted to leave and never see this place again, I decided to stay one more night so that I could drive well rested. The rest of the day, I sat in the living room of the house, staring into space, trying not to stare at the shadows in the room. As night came on, dread fell over me. I wanted to sleep, but I didn't want to dream. I felt paranoia about every corner of the house. I felt like something was watching me. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the creature from the lighthouse, but nothing was ever there. I felt a little bit of relief. It was over. It was a nightmare, and even though I'd gotten lost, I'd somehow made it back. When my heavy body and eyes couldn't take it anymore, I lay down on the couch in the living room. My eyes were closing when I heard loud tapping coming from the kitchen. My father's voice called out,
Please help me.